I still remember the first day I drove into Witness. The sky stretched endlessly above me, a wide expanse of pale blue dotted with the occasional wisp of cloud. It felt strange, seeing so much sky. I had spent my whole life in Manhattan, where the buildings crowded in on you, their shadows stretching across the streets like the fingers of some giant. Here, in this small town in southeastern Iowa, the air seemed lighter, the streets quieter, and the people, well, they smiled at you as you passed. It was the perfect place for a fresh start, or so I told myself. The town itself felt like a place frozen in time. No towering buildings, no rushing cabs, just a few small shops, an old diner, and a handful of houses that all seemed to have been built around the same time. Everything felt still, almost too quiet. I pulled up in front of the school, a squat brick building with large windows that seemed to reflect the endless sky. This would be my new home, my new life. Away from the city, away from him. When I first met Principal Reed, he was just as quiet as the town. A thin man, constantly adjusting his glasses, his voice barely above a whisper as he welcomed me to the school. "We're glad to have you here, Miss Abbott," he said, glancing at the clock on the wall as if he were already late for something. Witness Elementary is small, but the children are good. Mostly. I didn't think much of it at the time. Mostly good. That was just children being children, I figured. He handed me the keys to my classroom and left with a brief, nervous smile. My classroom was exactly what I expected from a rural school in the early 1970s. Old wooden desks, the kind with the inkwell holes still carved into the tops, and a chalkboard that looked like it had seen better days. There were no computers or fancy equipment, just books, pencils, and the ticking of the clock on the wall. It felt simple, almost comforting. I was ready to start fresh, to focus on teaching, and forget the life I had left behind in Manhattan. But it wasn't long before I met Tommy Clark. He came into my classroom that first Monday morning, and something about him felt off from the start. He was tall for a fourth grader, with sandy blonde hair that fell into his eyes. There was a stillness to him, a way he held himself apart from the other children. He didn't smile. He didn't say much. When I asked him to introduce himself to the class, he simply looked up at the ceiling, his gaze drifting toward the window. "Tommy Clark," he muttered, his voice barely audible. At recess, while the other children ran and laughed, Tommy stood off to the side, his eyes fixed on the sky. I watched him for a while, thinking maybe he was just shy, but there was something unsettling about the way he stared, as if he were waiting for something. I approached him, trying to make small talk. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Tommy?" I said, glancing up at the sky. He didn't look at me. "It's there," he whispered. His voice was soft, but I heard it. "What's there?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He just kept staring. Later that day, I went to Principal Reed to ask about Tommy. His reaction surprised me. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled some papers on his desk. "Tommy," he began, his voice even softer than usual. "Tommy was missing for a while. 4 months, actually." He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. He just showed up one day, no explanation. His parents, well, they don't like to talk about it. He didn't offer any more details, and I didn't press him. But something about the way he avoided eye contact told me there was more to the story. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Tommy. I tossed and turned in bed, the image of him staring at the sky stuck in my mind. I tried to tell myself that he was just a quiet, unusual boy, but something about him unsettled me. The next day, during recess, I watched him again, and sure enough, he was in the same spot, looking up. His eyes were fixed on the clouds, unmoving, unblinking. It wasn't just Tommy that began to feel off, though. Peter Barnes, one of the more lively boys in my class, came to me during recess, his face pale and eyes wide. "Miss Abbott," he said, his voice shaking, "Tommy." Tommy broke my leg. I rushed over, heart pounding, but when I got to him, Peter was standing perfectly fine, both legs intact. He blinked up at me, confused. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked. I opened my mouth to respond, but I had no idea what to say. Hadn't he just? From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Tommy Clark. His strange behavior, the unsettling incidents with the other children, and the eerie way he stared at the sky, it all started to weigh on me. But more than that, it made me start to question the quiet little town I had chosen to call home. The morning after the incident with Peter, I walked into the classroom feeling unsettled. The memory of his confusion the day before, his pale face, and then his sudden obliviousness gnawed at me. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But as I stood in front of the class, watching the students shuffle in, my eyes were drawn again to Tommy Clark. There he was, in his usual spot by the window, staring out at the sky. His face was blank, almost serene, and I couldn't help but wonder what went on in his mind. Was he aware of the effect he had on the other children? It didn't take long for more strange things to happen. During lunch, I noticed Amy Waters sitting by herself, unusually quiet. Normally, Amy was chatty and full of energy, always giggling with her friends. But today, she seemed distant, her eyes glazed over as she picked at her sandwich. I asked if she was feeling all right, and she just shrugged, not meeting my eyes. "I don't remember what happened," she said softly, before getting up and walking away, leaving her lunch half-eaten. When I glanced over at Tommy, he was still at his table, alone, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the cafeteria walls. I started keeping a diary after that. Each night, I would sit at my kitchen table, pen in hand, and write down every odd thing I noticed. Tommy staring at the sky, Peter's forgotten injury, Amy's sudden withdrawal. Every detail, no matter how small, went into that little book. I told myself it was just to help me make sense of things, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. As the days went on, the incidents became more frequent. During a math lesson, Peter suddenly stood up in the middle of class, his face blank. "Tommy," he whispered, before collapsing onto the floor. I rushed over, my heart pounding, and by the time I reached him, Peter was sitting up, rubbing his eyes, completely unaware of what had just happened. "What's going on?" he asked, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The other children watched, wide-eyed, but no one said a word. It was as though they, too, were unsure of what they had just seen. It wasn't long before I realized I had to confront Tommy's parents. The Clark family lived on the outskirts of town, in a small rundown house that looked as weary as they did. When I knocked on the door, it was Mr. Clark who answered. He looked older than I remembered, his eyes bloodshot, and his frame thinner than the last time I'd seen him. "Miss Abbott," he said quietly, his voice shaky, "I don't think it's a good idea for you to be here." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't walk away without answers. "I'm concerned about Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There have been incidents at school, and I think something's wrong." Mr. Clark didn't respond. Instead, he glanced nervously over his shoulder before stepping aside and motioning for me to come in. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the curtains drawn, and the air thick with the smell of something stale. Mrs. Clark sat at the kitchen table, her hands shaking as she scratched at her wrist, so hard I could see red welts forming beneath her nails. "We tried to warn you," Mrs. Clark muttered, her eyes darting between me and her husband. "But no one listens." She scratched harder, her voice rising in pitch. "It's the sky," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's always watching, always waiting." My heart raced as I listened, unsure of what to say. What did they mean? What did this have to do with Tommy? "Please," Mr. Clark interrupted, his voice filled with desperation. "Just leave it alone. He's different now. We don't know what happened, But he's not the same boy who disappeared. His words echoed in my head as I left their house, the weight of what they had said pressing down on me. What did they mean, not the same boy? I could barely wrap my mind around it. Back at school, things continued to spiral. The other children started avoiding Tommy altogether. They seemed to sense what I had been feeling, that something wasn't right. Even the normally easygoing Mr. Campbell, the third-grade teacher, began acting strangely. He stopped joining us in the teacher's lounge, and whenever I mentioned Tommy, he quickly changed the subject, his face tightening with discomfort. It was as if no one wanted to acknowledge what was happening. As the winter festival approached, the tension in the town grew palpable. The festival was the biggest event of the year, a time when the entire community came together to celebrate the season. But this year, there was an undercurrent of unease that no one wanted to talk about. The parents still smiled and chatted as they prepared for the festival, but there was a nervous energy in the air. I couldn't help but feel that everyone was waiting for something, though no one could say what. In the days leading up to the festival, I kept an even closer watch on Tommy. He grew quieter, if that was even possible, and his fixation on the sky only deepened. Whenever I looked at him, his gaze was always upwards, his face expressionless. It was as if the sky held some secret that only he could see, some terrible truth that none of us could comprehend. I tried to reach out to him, to talk to him, but every time I got close, he would retreat further into himself, leaving me with nothing but silence. And then, on the eve of the festival, I found Amy Waters standing by the window in the classroom, staring up at the darkening sky, her face as blank as Tommy's. "What's out there?" I asked her softly, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just kept staring, her lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. The sky outside seemed to press in on us, heavy and oppressive. And I knew then that whatever was coming, it wasn't just in my head. Something was happening in Witness, something far beyond my understanding. And Tommy Clark was at the center of it. The night of the winter festival was colder than I had expected. A biting wind swept through the town, but that didn't stop the families of Witness from gathering in the town square. I could hear the cheerful sound of children's laughter as they ran from booth to booth, their faces bright with excitement. But beneath that festive surface, I felt a dark undercurrent, a tension that had been building for weeks. It was as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, even if no one dared to acknowledge it. I arrived at the festival early, trying to shake the sense of dread that had been hanging over me since my last conversation with Tommy's parents. The sky was a dark, oppressive gray, thick clouds blotting out the stars. Even the moon seemed to have disappeared behind the heavy blanket of clouds, casting the town in a dim, eerie light. I kept my eyes on Tommy as he wandered through the crowd, his head tilted back, staring up at the sky as usual. It was as if nothing on the ground held any interest for him. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Every time I saw Tommy, that strange feeling of unease settled deeper into my bones. He moved through the crowd silently, his face expressionless, ignoring the other children as they played. I watched as Peter and Amy ran past him, laughing and shouting, but Tommy didn't even glance in their direction. His gaze remained fixed on the sky, as if he were waiting for something to come down and meet him. As the festival reached its peak, with the bonfire blazing and the smell of hot cider filling the air, I found myself drifting toward the edge of the crowd. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but something was pulling me away from the noise and the lights. And then I saw it. Tommy, standing near the base of the hill that overlooked the square. His arms were stretched out to his sides, and his head was tilted back further than I had ever seen before, his eyes wide open as he stared into the swirling clouds above. A strange, electric hum filled the air, almost like a low-pitched vibration that I could feel deep in my chest. Before I could even process what was happening, two children, Peter and Amy, began to lift off the ground. It was slow at first, almost imperceptible, as if the wind itself had caught hold of them and was gently pulling them up. But soon they were rising faster, their bodies twisting in the air like rag dolls, their faces slack with confusion and terror. The crowd started to scream, but the sounds felt distant to me, muffled by the roaring wind that seemed to surge from nowhere. I froze in place, watching helplessly as Peter and Amy were lifted higher and higher into the air. The clouds above them began to swirl, faster and faster, until they formed a massive vortex, a gaping, dark maw in the sky. It was as if the sky itself had opened up, revealing something terrible and hungry beyond. I could hear the children's cries, faint and distant, as they were pulled toward that horrifying mouth. My legs felt rooted to the ground, and my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. The crowd around me erupted into chaos, parents screaming and shouting, rushing forward to try to reach their children. But it was too late. Peter and Amy were gone, swallowed up by that monstrous, swirling mouth in the sky. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wind stopped. The sky closed up, the clouds drifting back into place as if nothing had happened. Tommy stood below, untouched, his arms still outstretched, his face eerily calm. For a moment, the entire town stood in stunned silence. Then the crowd surged forward, people shouting and crying, but no one seemed to know what to do. I could see parents pulling their children close, teachers rushing to comfort the students who were left. But there was nothing anyone could say. Peter and Amy were gone, and no one seemed to understand how or why. I stood there, numb, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. Tommy remained where he was, unmoving, as if he had nothing to do with what had just happened. But I knew he had been at the center of it all. And yet, he was untouched, as if the chaos around him didn't matter, as if he had simply been a vessel for whatever had taken those children. I wanted to go to him, to shake him, to demand answers, but my feet wouldn't move. The terror that gripped me was too strong, and all I could do was watch as Tommy slowly lowered his arms and turned to walk away, disappearing into the crowd. The festival was over, but the nightmare had just begun. The morning after the winter festival, the town of Witness felt quieter than ever, as though the world had collectively taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. I arrived at the school early, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, but the weight of what had happened hung over me like a heavy fog. The children trickled in one by one, their faces blank, their movements slow, as if they were sleepwalking through their morning routine. But the strangest thing was the absence of any mention of Peter and Amy. No one spoke about what had happened the night before. No parents had come to the school to demand answers. No teachers whispered in the lounge about the horrifying scene at the festival. Even Principal Reed, who was usually nervous and fidgety, carried on as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. I found myself glancing at the empty desks where Peter and Amy had once sat, expecting someone to ask about them, but no one did. It was as if they had never existed at all. I tried to keep my focus on teaching, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Tommy. He sat in his usual spot by the window, his gaze, as always, fixed on the sky. He hadn't changed at all since the festival. While the rest of the town seemed to have forgotten the terrifying events, I could feel the memory of it gnawing at me, refusing to let go. How could no one else remember? How could 2 children vanish into thin air, and the entire town act as though they had never been there? That afternoon, I made my way to Principal Reed's office, determined to get answers. I knocked on the door, and when he called me in, I was met with the same distracted smile he always wore. "Miss Abbott," he said, glancing at his paperwork. "What can I do for you?" My heart raced as I tried to find the right words, but I realized, in that moment, that Reed didn't remember either. His eyes held no recognition of what I was about to say. Peter and Amy. I began slowly, watching his reaction. "They're missing." Principal Reed frowned, tapping his pen on the desk. "Peter and Amy," he repeated, sounding confused. "I'm sorry, Miss Abbott, but I don't recall any students by those names." My blood ran cold. How could he forget? How could anyone forget? I left his office in a daze, the world around me spinning, and it took all my strength to keep myself from breaking down. It was as if the town itself had erased the memory of the festival, of the children, of everything. The next few days passed in a blur. Tommy continued to come to class, his behavior unchanged, as if nothing had ever happened. The other students went about their routines, laughing, playing, and learning, but a hollowness had settled over the classroom. I kept waiting for someone to mention Peter or Amy, for one of their friends to ask where they had gone, but no one ever did. It was as though they had been wiped clean from the town's collective memory, leaving me as the only one who still knew the truth. The Clark family left town soon after the festival. I heard about it through a passing comment from Mr. Campbell, who mentioned seeing their house packed up and a for sale sign planted in the yard. It wasn't surprising. After everything that had happened with Tommy, I had expected them to disappear eventually, just like Peter and Amy. But even their departure was quiet, unnoticed by the rest of the town, as if it was just another piece of the strange puzzle that Witness had become. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself relying more and more on my diary. It was the only proof I had that any of it had happened. Every night, I would sit at my kitchen table and write, pouring out my thoughts, trying to make sense of the things I had seen. But the more I wrote, the more distant the memories became. I found myself questioning my own sanity, wondering if maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Was it possible that I was losing my mind? Had the winter festival been nothing more than a nightmare? One evening, as I flipped through the pages of my diary, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My handwriting had changed. The early entries, from when I had first arrived in Witness, were clear, precise. But as I turned the pages, the writing became more erratic, shaky, as if the words themselves were slipping away from me. The memories felt hazy, distant, as though they were fading, just like the town seemed to want them to. I tried to reach out to others, parents, teachers, even the townspeople I had grown somewhat familiar with. But every time I brought up the events of the festival or mentioned Peter and Amy, I was met with blank stares and confused smiles. It was as though the very fabric of reality in Witness had been altered, reshaped to erase the past. The town had moved on, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the memory of what I had seen, unable to let it go. It wasn't long before I realized I couldn't stay in Witness any longer. The town was suffocating me, slowly erasing my own memories, just as it had erased the children. I packed up my things quietly, leaving my little house behind with a sense of relief and sadness. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. There was no point. They wouldn't have understood. As I drove out of town, the familiar quiet streets fading in my rearview mirror, I couldn't help but glance at the sky one last time. The sky was clear, an endless stretch of blue that seemed so normal, so peaceful. But I knew better. I knew what lurked beyond those clouds, waiting, watching. The memory of Peter and Amy, of that terrible mouth in the sky, would never leave me. And even though I was leaving Witness behind, I knew the town would never truly let me go. Its secrets, its silence, would follow me wherever I went, haunting me for the rest of my life. As I drove away, the weight of it all pressed down on me. I had come to Witness to escape my past, to start over. But now I realized that some things can never be escaped. Some things stay with you, no matter how far you run. Witness was one of those things, and so were the children lost to the sky.